This morning, I'm going to talk to you about a particularly virulent and dangerous form of divine madness, which is called falling in love. From a practical point of view, it's one of the most insane things you can do, or that can happen to you. In the eyes of a given woman or man, an otherwise plain and ordinary person can appear to be a god or goddess incarnate, such an enchantment that one can say, in the words of an old song, which probably dates me, every little breeze seems to whisper Louise. This is an extraordinarily disruptive and subversive experience in the conduct of human affairs because you never know when it will strike or for what reason. It's like contracting a chronic disease once you get into it. We often try to resolve it by making it the basis for a marriage, an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do. This is because, in Western civilization, we have a curious tradition of the family that is the most ridiculous combination of disparate ideas imaginable. When we go back to the origins of Western civilization in Hebrew and Christian traditions, we find that the idea of marriage and the experience of falling in love were separate. In agrarian cultures, nobody ever chose their marriage partner. There are exceptions, like ancient Greece, where you might occasionally find a woman known as a parthenos, which has been mistranslated as virgin. The correct meaning of parthenos is a woman who chooses her own husband. And there were very few of them. In that passage in the Gospel and the book of the prophet Isaiah, where it says, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel." The Greek word is parthenos, so the term doesn't strictly mean a virgin, although a woman who chooses her own husband might conceivably be a virgin. But by and large, marriage was an alliance of families, a contract not simply for raising children, but also to create a social unit smaller than a village. Families were rather large, and the elders, grandparents, had a significant say in whom their children would marry. They would negotiate using go-betweens and consider not only if the girl was suitable for their son and vice versa, but also the dowry she would bring and whether the alliance would be advantageous for both families. Such negotiations were routine for royal families, where marital alliances had great political weight. Yet, as we know, royalty often kept concubines and mistresses to avoid monogamy becoming monotony. This background explains why, to this day, marriage is a civil or religious ceremony based on a legal contract, complete with laws making it difficult to exit. Society believes it requires a stable environment for children and for general stability. When people break up a marriage, it's unsettling. You see a couple you thought was the happiest and best adjusted split up, and you begin to wonder if all your friends are crazy. Into this feudal conception of marriage, another tradition emerged, largely from the poetic movement centered in southern France, in Provence during the Middle Ages, the cult of courtly love. Scholars debate its nature. According to one theory, the knightly lover, also a poet, would select a married lady as his heart's desire. He'd yearn for her, sing under her window, and send tokens of devotion. Yet he must never consummate this love. Not only would that be adultery, but it would ruin the state of longing. Denis de Rougemont explores this theory in Love in the Western World, arguing that true love should be unfulfilled and unhappy. The other theory, probably more realistic, is that the noble ladies were bored. Their husbands were often away hunting, fighting, and wenching, so they had lovers too. This adulterous poetry flourished because, as my friend says, there should always be strict disapproval of adultery and fornication. If not, if it's too easy, it loses its allure. I suggest in Beyond Theology that Christian repression of sex might even have been designed to make people more interested in it. Liberal promiscuity might otherwise become boring, causing people to seek less healthy diversions. The gradual fusion of these two approaches gave rise to our idea of romantic marriage, in which the two trends are rather incompatible. You're supposed to fall in love with someone of your own choice and then enter into a relationship bound by a legal contract. Standing before a magistrate or priest, you solemnly vow fidelity, until death do you part. A heavy commitment. Two young people, eager to embrace each other, might promise anything to fulfill this desire. While many married couples are happy and maintain a lifelong alliance, we rarely hear about them because good news isn't news. Instead, we read about unhappy couples in newspapers. Most married people, I think, are lucky. There's no guaranteed way to make marriage work. Every attempt to do so often builds up hidden hostility. One might think, I must control my emotions for the sake of children, society, or whatever else. But in doing so, they might be untrue to themselves. They make lists of reminders, keep anniversaries, and try to be loving, yet with every effort, expectations build, often resulting in unmet needs and growing resentment. The awkwardness increases when people fall in love with someone else, despite being married. This is a disruptive experience. In Victorian novels, lovers often part for the sake of duty, saying it's best for us not to see each other anymore. Such sweeping, powerful emotions are often denied, buried, and stifled. The question becomes, what should one do? Well, as I've often said, I'm not a preacher, and therefore I don't know what you should do. But I would like to make some reflections on this particular form of madness, and to raise again a very disturbing question. And this disturbing question is as follows. Is it only when you are in love with another person that you see them as they really are? In the ordinary way, when you are not in love with people, you see only a fragmented version of that being. Because when you are in love with someone, you do indeed see them as a divine being. And suppose that's what they are truly. Your eyes have, by your beloved, been opened, in which case your beloved is serving to you as a kind of guru and initiator. And that is why there is a form of sexual yoga, based on the idea that man and woman are to each other as mutual guru and student. Through a tremendous outpouring of psychic energy, in total devotion and worship to this other person, who is respectively the goddess or the god, you realize by total fusion and contact with the other organism, that you go down to the divine center in them. And it bounces back and you discover your own. Or you could put it in this way, which is another aspect of it, by falling in love and regarding falling in love not just as a sort of sexual infatuation, because it's always more than that, isn't it? I mean, you can have great sexual enjoyment with a pleasant friend, but you may do so simply because he or she appeals to your aesthetic senses. But when you fall in love, it's a much more serious involvement. You just cannot forget this person. You feel miserable when not in their presence. You're always yearning. Let's get to see more of each other. Let's get together. We're completely entangled. And then, you see, you've actually kind of, what I would call a spiritual element has been introduced. And the Hindus were sensible enough to realize that this was a means of awakening, enlightenment, and therefore it was surrounded by a sort of rigid religious ritual meditative art, with a form of sexual yoga that is designed to allow the feeling of mutual love, to the extent of grand passion, to have an extremely fitting fulfillment and expression. Falling in love is a thing that strikes like lightning and is, therefore, extremely analogous to the mystical vision. We don't know how people really attain the mystical vision. There is not yet a very clear rationale as to how it happens, because we do know that it is open to many people who never did anything to look for it. And many people, especially in adolescence, have had the mystical vision all of a sudden, without the slightest warning and with no previous interest in that kind of thing. On the other hand, many people who have practiced yoga or Zen disciplines or what have you for years and years and years have never seen it. And in both classes, there are, of course, exceptions. There are those who have never had the spontaneous experience, and there are those who, through yoga or Zen, have attained this insight. But as yet, we are not clear as to why it comes about, and if there is any method of attaining it, the best one is probably to give up the whole idea of getting it. But you see, it is completely unpredictable. And so, it is, in that way, like falling in love, capricious and, therefore, crazy. But if you should be so fortunate as to encounter either of these experiences, it seems to me to be a total denial of life to refuse it. What we therefore have to admit in our society is that, to contain this kind of madness, we must be far more realistic about the marriage arrangement so that it can contain the possibility of falling in love. When you base marriage, you see, on the falling in love and go into a pseudo-love affair, which is simply hot pants, and set up a rigid family in which you expect the other person to always be in love with you, and then, in that context, you go and fall in love, then your falling in love is, of necessity, disruptive of the marriage and of the family. But you see, it could only disrupt it because the love relationship between the two partners was false, was pretended. But if marriage were based more on the old idea of the reasonable contract between two people to bring up children, who may be expected, at best, to be good friends, and to allow each other to be persons, that is to say, in the ordinary sense of the word person, to have their own freedom, then, if love strikes, it is tolerated within this arrangement, provided you're not going to be so unreasonable as to say, well, since I've fallen in love with somebody else, I must marry them. Well, that's perfectly ridiculous. You see, in this way, we can think about and structure the necessary, stable social institution of family, sometime without it being constantly threatened or foundering on the rocks of love. Now, you see, this then means that when people marry, if they take any vows at all to each other, instead of saying that they will always be true to each other in the sense of meaning, I will always love you, it means, I will be true to you in the sense of, I will always be truthful to you. I will not pretend that my feelings towards you are other than what they are. Because I marry you because I think that you are a reasonable person to live with, and therefore I want you to be you. I don't want you to be someone else. I don't want you to be a rubber stamp of me. How boring would that be? So, it is really an arrangement, not of us leaving, as we always say jocularly, did you get the ball and chain on him? But an arrangement in which people set each other free and make an alliance to cooperate with each other in certain ways. Now, if it should so occur that there is immense sexual attraction to each other, so much the better. But this should not be a primary factor in entering into marriage. Admittedly, you must be, to a certain extent, attractive to each other. Otherwise, there will be no progeny. But this seems to me to be a sensible and reasonable view. And just because it is sensible and reasonable, it can accommodate what is not sensible and reasonable, which is falling in love. We should regard, then, marriage as it is, especially if it should possibly be called holy matrimony, as a mutual, setting free of two people to live together in freedom and, therefore, in responsibility. Because the present situation, although it's pretending to be responsible, is in fact extremely irresponsible. It is dishonesty with respect to the way you feel towards another person. Well, now really, when we go back then to falling in love and say, it's crazy falling. You see, we don't say rising into love. There is in it the idea of the fall. And it goes back, as a matter of fact, that is very exciting play, providing neither side wins. I mean, imagine what it would be like if the Libertines won and they took over the church so that on Wednesday evenings, the young Presbyterian group could meet for prayer through sex. Every child would go to the school physician for a course in hygienics. They would have classes and plastic models, and all the children would do it in class in very clean, hygienic circumstances, all sprayed with rubbing alcohol. Imagine how boring it would all become. So, you see, the people who say, no, modesty is important, have something right about it. But they must not be allowed to get away with it, and they must not be obliterated. You see, life works that way. Let's take an entirely different analogy. Let's take a given biological group, a species we will call A. It has a natural enemy, B. One day, A gets furious at its natural enemy, B, and says, let us obliterate B. They gather their forces and knock out their natural enemy. Suddenly, after a while, they begin to get weak. They get overpopulated. There is nobody around to eat up their surplus members, and they do not have to keep their muscles tensed against any enemy. They begin to fall apart because they have destroyed their enemy. What they should do is cultivate the enemy. That is the real meaning of love your enemy. There is such a thing as a beloved enemy. And if you don't have a beloved enemy, in other words, if the flies and the spiders don't go together, there would be too many spiders or too many flies. These balances keep the course of nature going, which is exactly the same thing as between the libertines and the prudes. They need each other. And you should thank, if you have a prudish father and mother, you should be very grateful to them for having made sex so interesting. So, don't defy them completely. Don't go to your own campus with signs bearing four-letter words, because that's going to spoil the show. But every generation must react to the one before it. This keeps this tension going. It is by this tension, this play of the opposites, that we have the love that makes the world go round.